The silence in the penthouse was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on the thick pile of the cream-colored rug and absorbed the frantic pulse of the city 30 floors below. Kaya stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the lights of Tokyo bleed into a glittering, impersonal tapestry. For 5 years, this view had been her companion, her cage, her gilded consolation prize. She was 28 years old, and she felt ancient. Her reflection stared back from the flawless glass, a woman she barely recognized. The bespoke silk dress, the diamonds at her ears, the severe, elegant knot of her hair, it was all part of a uniform. Armor. She lifted her left hand, turning it in the low light. The wedding ring was not a diamond, but a heavy, saddle-shaped piece of imperial jade, the color of a deep forest pool, set in a cage of dark platinum. It had been his one concession to her taste. He'd wanted a stone that would dwarf the sun. She'd wanted something that felt like it had been pulled from the earth, something with a soul. He had given it to her, but like everything else, it came with the unspoken weight of possession. The hushed slide of a door behind her announced his return. She didn't need to turn. The very atmosphere in the room shifted, the molecules rearranging themselves to accommodate his presence. The air grew colder, tighter. The faint, clean scent of cedar and rain, the signature note of his custom cologne, preceded him. It was a scent that had once promised her the world, and now only smelled of secrets and blood. Ryo Tanaka moved like a shadow given form. He was a man carved from stillness, his power expressed not in grand gestures, but in the absolute economy of his every movement. Tonight, he wore a dark charcoal suit that fit his lean, powerful frame so perfectly it looked less like clothing and more like a second skin. He stopped several feet behind her, his presence a palpable force at her back. He said nothing. He rarely did. He believed words were for the weak, for those who needed to persuade. He simply was, and the world bent to his will. She had learned to read the silence, to find the nuances in the spaces between his breaths. Tonight, the silence was different. It was stained. She could feel the lingering echo of violence on him, the razor-thin edge of adrenaline that hadn't yet dissipated. She saw it in the rigid line of his shoulders, the way his hand, resting on the back of a leather armchair, was curled just a fraction too tight. "You're late," she said, her voice even, betraying none of the storm raging inside her. Her gaze remained fixed on the city below. "Business was concluded," he replied. His voice was a low baritone, smooth as polished granite, and just as cold. It was the voice that could command armies of men in tailored suits and end lives with a single, whispered order. Kaya finally turned, her movements fluid and deliberate. She met his eyes across the vast, sterile living room. His face was a masterpiece of control, handsome in a way that was almost cruel, with high cheekbones and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from stone. But his eyes were the true tells. They were dark, intelligent, and utterly empty of warmth. They saw everything and revealed nothing. Tonight, however, she saw a flicker of something else deep within them: weariness. The profound, soul-deep exhaustion of a man who held an empire in his fists and could never, not for a moment, let go. "Your business," she said, letting the words hang in the air. "It always is." He didn't rise to the bait. He simply watched her, his expression unchanging. He was waiting for her to break, to cry, to scream. It was a dance they had perfected over 5 years of marriage. She would push, and he would absorb it with infuriating calm until she exhausted herself against his implacable walls. But tonight was different. Tonight, she was the calm one. The storm had already passed, leaving behind a terrible, clarifying peace. "I went to the gallery today," she said, her voice soft. The art gallery was her island, the one piece of her old life he'd allowed her to keep. A place of color and light and expression in a world of gray concrete and shadowed alleys. "Mika asked about you. Asked when you were going to come see her new installation. She thinks you're a patron of the arts." A bitter laugh almost escaped her, but she swallowed it. "I told her you were a very private man." Ryo's gaze didn't waver. "It is better that way." "Better for who, Ryo?" she asked, taking a step closer. The heels of her shoes made no sound on the thick rug. Better for the men who fear you, or for the wife who barely knows you? For the first time, a flicker of irritation crossed his features. You have everything. A home most women in this city would kill for. A business that thrives because my name protects it. You want for nothing. That was it. The line. The one that always severed the last thread of her hope. She stopped in the center of the room, the cavernous space feeling like a stage. She looked at him, the most powerful man in Tokyo's underworld, the head of the Tanaka clan, her husband. And she felt nothing but a profound, aching pity. I gave you everything, she said, the words quiet but carrying the force of a final judgment. I gave you my loyalty, my body, my silence. I learned your world, your codes, your enemies. I stood by you while you built this empire on the bones of your rivals. I became the perfect, untouchable wife of the boss, the one part of your life no one could use against you. She let out a long, slow breath. And in return, you gave me things. You gave me a penthouse and a car and a closet full of clothes I don't even like. You didn't give me you. You gave me a ghost who shares my bed. He remained silent, his jaw tightening. That was his only concession to emotion. Kaya looked down at her hand, at the heavy jade ring. With her other hand, she gripped it. It was cold against her skin. With a slow, deliberate twist, she pulled it from her finger. The absence of its weight was a shock, a sudden, terrifying lightness. She walked to the low, polished mahogany table that separated them and placed the ring in the center of its gleaming surface. The soft click it made was the loudest sound she had ever heard. I'm done, she said. He finally moved. It was just a fractional shift, but on him it was a seismic event. His gaze dropped from her face to the ring, then back to her. For the first time since he had walked into the room, he looked at her, truly saw her. And in the depths of his dark eyes, she saw not anger, but a raw, unguarded flicker of disbelief, of something that looked terrifyingly like panic. Kaya, he said her name, and it was not a statement. It was a command wrapped in a question, a plea disguised as a threat. It was the sound of a king realizing his most prized possession was walking away. But she didn't flinch. She just held his gaze, her heart a cold, steady drum in her chest. The fear was gone. In its place was a vast, empty freedom. Rio's face settled back into its mask of cold control, but the panic in his eyes remained, a banked fire behind a sheet of ice. You are not done, he said, the words low and precise, each one a steel nail pinning her in place. You are my wife. You are the head of this family's household. Leaving is not an option. It is a fantasy. It's my reality, she countered, her voice unwavering. I'm leaving in the morning. He took a step toward her, closing the distance until only the mahogany table and the abandoned ring separated them. You are not listening. This is not a negotiation. The Ishikawa-gumi have been testing our defenses for weeks. Your departure, now, would be read as a schism, a weakness. They would see it as an opening. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. For your own safety, you will remain here. You will continue your duties. This conversation is over. It was a cage, polished and presented as protection. The doors of the penthouse, which had once felt merely locked, now felt welded shut. But something inside her had irrevocably broken. The fear she was supposed to feel was absent, replaced by a cold, sharp anger. So, I'm a prisoner. You are being protected, he corrected, his voice devoid of emotion. The days that followed were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Rio moved a portion of his operations into the penthouse. Men in dark suits with impassive faces became part of the decor, their presence a constant, silent reminder of her confinement. His most trusted lieutenant, a quiet, watchful man named Saito, was stationed permanently in the hallway outside her suite. The gilded cage now had visible bars. This forced proximity, meant to control her, had an unintended effect. She was no longer seeing the myth, the untouchable boss who disappeared for days on end. She was seeing the man. She saw him in the early hours of the morning, long before the sun rose, poring over ledgers and maps in his study, the harsh lamplight carving deep lines of exhaustion into his face. She saw the way he massaged his temples when he thought no one was looking, a gesture of profound weariness. She saw the weight of his empire, not as a source of power, but as a crushing burden. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered into the silent living room. A single light was on in his study. Drawn by an impulse she didn't understand, she approached the open door. He was standing with his back to her, staring at a small, silver frame on his desk. It was the only personal item in the entire, sterile room. It was not a photo of them. He must have sensed her presence, because he spoke without turning. "You should be asleep." "So should you," she replied, stepping into the doorway. He didn't answer. He just continued to stare at the photograph. After a long moment, he picked it up, his thumb brushing over the glass. "Her name was Akari," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "She was my father's advisor. When he died, she became mine. She taught me everything. How to read men. How to balance honor and necessity. She believed the code of our world was a weapon, if wielded correctly." Kaya remained silent, listening. This was the most he had spoken to her in years. "A rival clan wanted our territory in Ginza. They couldn't break our organization, so they looked for a weakness in me. They found 1 inch he finally turned, and his eyes were dark with a memory that was still bleeding. I respected Akari. I valued her counsel above all others. They saw that affection. They used it. They took her, and they sent me a message. Her life for the territory." "What did you do?" Kaya whispered. "I did what a boss must do. I refused. To give in to a demand like that is to show a fatal weakness. It is to invite every other clan to take a piece of you." He set the frame down with surgical precision. "I retaliated. I destroyed their clan. I burned their name from the history of the city. But I was too late to save her." He looked at Kaya, and for the first time, she understood the vast, empty space he kept between them. Affection is a liability. It is a weapon your enemies will find and use against you. I have kept you separate from this world, Kaya. I have kept you clean. I will not make the same mistake twice. He thought he was protecting her. By starving her, by isolating her, he thought he was keeping her safe. The revelation was so twisted, so heartbreaking, that it left her speechless. The next afternoon, the abstract threat became terrifyingly real. A call came from Saito. A bomb had been discovered under the car meant to take her to the gallery. It was sophisticated, designed not to detonate on a timer, but by a remote signal. It was a message from the Ishikawagumi. "We can reach her whenever we want." Ryo's security detail wanted to move her to a fortified safe house in the mountains. She was packing a small bag, her hands trembling, when the sheer futility of it washed over her. Hiding was just a slower death. It was validating everything the Ishikawa clan believed about her, that she was a liability, a distraction. She walked into the living room where Ryo was issuing orders to his men. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. Every man in the room froze and looked at her. Ryo turned slowly. "This is not a discussion." "Yes, it is," she insisted, stepping forward. "They want you to run. They want you to hide me away so you're distracted, worrying about me. So your men are split between protecting your territory and protecting your wife. Hiding me proves them right. It makes me the weakness they think I am." She met his stunned gaze. "I'm not going anywhere." It was a deliberate choice. A choice to stay, not as his possession, but as his partner in this war. It was the first move she had made on the board, and it changed the entire game. Later, he was briefing his lieutenants, a large tactical map of the Shinjuku district spread across the dining table. Kaya watched from the doorway, listening to them debate ambush points and patrol routes. They were planning to reinforce a known crossing point. "You're wrong," she said, stepping into the room. Saito and the other men stared at her, their expressions a mixture of shock and disapproval. Ryo's face was unreadable. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. She walked to the table, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but she pushed it down. They know you'll reinforce the bridge. It's too obvious. It's a feint. Her finger traced a thin, forgotten alleyway on the map, a service route for the district's high-end restaurants. They'll hit your supply convoy here. It's where your new alliance with the Mori family is weakest. A strike there doesn't just hurt you. It makes you look weak to your new partners. A heavy silence descended on the room. Rio studied her, then the map, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He didn't thank her. He didn't acknowledge her insight in front of his men. He simply looked at Saito and said, "Change the deployment. Double the guard on the service route." Later that night, the attack came exactly where she had predicted. It was repelled, a major victory for the Tanaka clan. The penthouse was quiet. Kaya stood on the balcony, the cool night air a balm on her skin. She heard him approach, felt his presence behind her, closer than he'd stood in years. She could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell the faint scent of cedar and smoke. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice a low rumble next to her ear. She didn't turn. She kept her eyes on the endless city lights. "For 5 years, I've done nothing but watch you, listen to you, and learn you," she said softly. "I know how you think. Which means I know how your enemies think you think." She finally turned her head, her cheek almost brushing his shoulder. "You just never thought to ask." The victory solidified Rio's position, but it enraged the Ishikawa boss. Kaya was no longer just a wife, a potential pawn. She was an asset, a strategist hidden in plain sight. The war became personal. The next move from the enemy was swift and brutal. Rio was at a dinner meeting at a neutral restaurant in Ginza when the assault came. It wasn't a subtle hit. It was a declaration of total war. Kaya was in the penthouse, watching a film she couldn't focus on, when the first news alert flashed across the screen.
En explosion.
A firefight in a high-end district. The restaurant's name was mentioned. Her blood ran cold. She called Saito, but the line went straight to a secure voicemail. She called Rio's personal number. No answer. For the next 2 hours, she was suspended in a terrifying silence. The men guarding her were stoic, their faces grim, but they had no information. For 2 hours, she didn't know if her husband, the man she claimed to be done with, was alive or dead. The agony of that uncertainty was a physical thing. It was a hollow, aching chasm in her chest that stole her breath. She paced the length of the penthouse, her mind racing. She had told herself she felt nothing for him, that the love had died years ago, smothered by the coldness and the silence. She had been lying. The thought of a world without him in it was unbearable, a gray, desolate landscape. Just as her control began to fray, the elevator chimed. The door slid open and he walked in. He was flanked by his men, his suit jacket gone, his white shirt stained with dust and a smear of blood that wasn't his. There was a fresh gash high on his cheekbone, but he was moving under his own power. He was alive. The relief that crashed over her was so total, so overwhelming, it buckled her knees. He saw her from across the room, and his relentless forward motion faltered for a half-second. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, the entire brutal, violent world outside ceased to exist. There was only the cavernous space between them, charged with everything they had never said. He dismissed his men with a curt nod, and they were alone.
He didn't speak.
He just walked toward her, his gaze never leaving hers. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes. "You're hurt," she breathed, her hand lifting instinctively toward his face. He caught her wrist, his grip firm but not painful. "It is nothing." But while he had been fighting for his life, she had been fighting a different kind of war. In those 2 hours of silence, she had done the unthinkable. Using the secure laptop in his study and the access codes she had memorized over the years, she had bypassed his intelligence network and launched her own investigation. She had dug into the Ishikawa boss's background, not his clan, but the man himself. And she had found something his men had missed. A disgruntled former lover, a woman he had discarded callously, who knew all of his financial secrets. She had already made contact. She had arranged a meeting for the next day, using her gallery as neutral ground. It was a breathtaking risk, a leap into his world that she could never take back. "While you were gone," she said, her voice low and intense, "I found something." She told him about the woman, the hidden ledgers, the key to dismantling the Ishikawa gumi from the inside without firing another shot. His reaction was not what she expected. It wasn't relief or gratitude. It was fury, a cold, terrifying rage ignited in his eyes. "You did what?" he snarled, his grip on her wrist tightening. "You reached out to an enemy's associate? You arranged a meeting? You put yourself on their radar? You could have been killed. And you couldn't," she shot back, yanking her arm free. "You walk into firefights, and I'm supposed to sit here and arrange flowers? You wanted to protect me by locking me in a cage, Rio. But the cage is what was killing me. I am not Akari. I am not some fragile piece of your past you failed to protect. I am your wife." The anger in his face fractured, his control finally, blessedly, breaking. The raw emotion underneath was stark and painful to see. "The day I met you," he said, his voice rough, broken, "was the first day in 10 years I forgot what I was. I forgot the blood and the packs and the weight of my father's name." He took a step closer, his gaze burning into hers. "Being with you, it's the only time the silence in my head stops. I kept you separate because I thought it would keep you pure, safe. I was wrong. I didn't protect you. I only made you lonely." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. It was not an apology, not a declaration of love. It was a confession, something far more intimate and dangerous. It was everything. The next day, the Ishikawa boss sent his reply. It wasn't a bullet or a bomb. It was a message delivered directly to her gallery. A single, perfect, black orchid, left on the front desk. It was the same rare flower Rio had delivered to her every Monday for 5 years. A perversion of his one tender gesture. A promise that he knew who she was, and he was coming for her. The information Kaya had secured was a fatal blow to the Ishikawa clan. Rio used it to systematically turn their allies and drain their finances. The rival boss was cornered, his empire crumbling. He became a desperate animal. He made one last, desperate play, not for power, but for revenge. He set a trap, a false rumor of a meeting across town, designed to lure Rio and the bulk of his security detail away. His real target was the penthouse. He wanted to take the one thing Rio could not replace, his wife. But Kaya was no longer the woman who waited. She had become a queen in her own right. She anticipated the move, saw the flawed logic of a desperate man. Working with Saito, who now looked at her with a newfound, profound respect, she planned a countermove. She refused to hide. When the assassins breached the penthouse's security, expecting to find a terrified woman hiding in a panic room, they found something else entirely. Kaya was waiting for them in the center of the main living area. She sat in a high-backed armchair, a glass of water on the table beside her, the picture of unnerving calm. Her stillness, her lack of fear, disoriented them. It was the crucial second of hesitation Sato's men needed. The ambush was swift, silent, and brutal. Kaya never moved from her chair. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She simply watched as the threat was neutralized, her intelligence the sharpest weapon in the room. Rio returned not to a scene of chaos and tragedy, but to one of quiet, lethal efficiency. His men were securing the perimeter. Saito was giving a low report. And in the middle of it all was Kaya, unharmed, untouched, and in absolute control. He walked toward her, his eyes taking in the scene, but his focus was entirely on her. He saw her not as the woman he needed to protect, but as the force that had just held his center. He stopped before her chair, ignoring everyone else in the room.
He didn't speak.
He simply reached down and gently cupped her face, his thumbs stroking her jawline. It was a gesture of reverence, of awe, a silent acknowledgement of who she had become. She was not his weakness. She was his strength. The war had a cost. In the final sweep against the last of the Ishikawa loyalists, Saito was badly wounded. He would live, but his days as a soldier were over. It was a stark reminder that in their world, Victory was never clean. It was always paid for in blood and loyalty. Days later, a new kind of silence settled over Tokyo. Ryo's power was absolute, his last rival erased. He found Kaya on the balcony, watching the sun set over their city. The jade and platinum ring sat on the marble railing between them, where it had been since she'd left it there. He stood beside her, not speaking for a long time. Finally, he said, "It's over." "The war outside, maybe," she replied softly, not looking at him. He nodded, a quiet acceptance. "Everything I have is yours, Kaya. My name. This empire. It was always yours. I was just too much of a coward to let you claim it." She finally turned to look at him. His face was unmasked, his dark eyes holding nothing but a raw, vulnerable truth. She looked from his face to the ring on the railing, the symbol of a life that had almost broken her. She thought of the gilded cage, the suffocating loneliness. Then she thought of the thrill of the fight, the sharp, clear power of her own mind, and the man who had finally, truly seen her for what she was. She did not pick up the ring. Instead, she reached out and took his hand. His skin was warm, his fingers calloused and strong. The hand of a killer, a ruler, a king. In her grasp, it was just a hand. A choice. Her choice. The city lights blurred into a river of gold below them. The silence between them was different now. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a shared understanding, forged in betrayal and rebuilt in blood. He was the monster who ruled Tokyo's shadows, and she was the woman who had walked into those shadows and made them her own. He did not own her. She had simply chosen his kingdom, and in doing so, had become its undisputed queen. The ring could stay where it was. Their bond was now forged of something far stronger and far more dangerous than platinum and stone.